declared the province of Gangwon-do, stretching into both South and North Korea, a symbol of peace and prosperity, as the past and future host of landmark events in the two Koreas' relations. Bank of Korea Governor Lee Ju-yeol meets with the country's major commercial banks to press on them the seriousness of Korea's economic difficulties after data showed the economy actually shrank in the first quarter. And representatives from 37 countries meet in Beijing for a forum on China's Belt and Road project to build infrastructure and strengthen trade routes from Asia to Europe to Africa. It's 4:00 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for tuning in to our afternoon broadcast. I'm Devin Whiting. President Moon says the eastern province of Gangwon-do is the new symbol of peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula. During a trip to the region on Friday, focusing on the economy, the president met with government officials and business leaders about ways to foster economic growth through peace. He highlighted that it was where the so-called Pyeongchang Peace Olympics were held last year. He also promised to promote tours and festivals in the demilitarized zone and to work to resume tours to North Korea's Kumgangsan Mountain. President Moon also expressed high hopes of connecting the region to Eurasia through railways and making it the logistics hub of Northeast Asia. He called for joint efforts between the central government and the province to lay the groundwork for future inter-Korean economic projects. And this morning, while in Gangwon-do, President Moon also comforted the victims of the wildfires that caused widespread damage in Goseong earlier this month. He paid a visit to temporary shelters that are being used by around 160 people whose homes were destroyed by the fires. President Moon also inspected sites where restoration work is ongoing. He promised local residents that the government will do its best to help them return to their daily lives, while thanking volunteers and military personnel for their work. It's the second time the president has visited the scene of the disaster. Tomorrow will be a year since the first summit between President Moon and North Korea's Kim Jong-un. And in their declaration at Panmunjeom, they made a number of promises. Our Unification Ministry correspondent Oh Jung-hee looks into how much of that has been implemented and what remains to be done.
Improving inter-Korean relations, lowering military tensions, and setting lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. With these as the major pillars, the Panmunjeom Declaration stipulated several action plans for South and North Korea. So let's see how these action plans have been carried out over the past year. In August last year, at North Korea's Mount Kumgangsan Resort, Seoul and Pyongyang held a week-long reunions of families separated by the Korean War, the first of its kind in 3 years. It brought together roughly 200 families from South and North Korea who met each other for the first time after the two Koreas' division in 1945. A month later, Seoul and Pyongyang opened a joint liaison office in the Goseong Industrial Complex. It's the first ever inter-Korean communication channel that runs 24/7. Liaison officers are meeting every day to exchange documents or share notices. The establishment of the contact office was followed by President Moon Jae-in's trip to the North Korean capital for his third summit with Kim Jong-un. Being the first visit by South Korean president to the North in over a decade, the Pyongyang summit led to a military agreement and drew out Pyongyang's promises to dismantle key nuclear and missile facilities. South and North Korea jointly celebrated the 11th anniversary of their 2007 summit agreement on October 4th. They also formed joint teams for a number of international sporting events, including the Asian Games last year. But most importantly, Seoul and Pyongyang took actions to turn the DMZ into a peace zone by, for example, removing guard posts and linking up a cross-border road. However, left unresolved are inter-Korean projects on linking and modernizing railways and roads and declaring an end to the Korean War. The two Koreas conducted basic surveys on railways and roads in the north and at cross-border sections and even held a groundbreaking ceremony, but real construction can't begin unless sanctions are eased. South and North Korea had also hoped to formally declare an end to the Korean War in 2018 to start multilateral talks on signing an official peace treaty, but that never materialized. All in all, the two Koreas succeeded in activating dialogue, expanding interactions, and easing tensions, but progress will have to be made on the denuclearization front to make steps forward in economic cooperation and ending the Korean War. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
Kim Jong-un, meanwhile, has returned from his summit in Russia with President Putin, and reports say he's blaming the standstill in nuclear talks on the U.S. He says peace and security on the Korean Peninsula depends entirely on America's attitude. The North Korean Central News Agency reported Friday on Kim's meeting with the Russian president the day before. According to the report, the leaders assessed the situation on the Korean Peninsula, and Kim said it's reached a critical point where things might have to go back to how they were because, quote, the U.S. took a unilateral attitude in bad faith at the Hanoi summit. He also said the North will prepare for any situation. Kim and Putin yesterday reportedly discussed ways to promote strategic communication and tactical collaboration to ensure peace and security and on the peninsula and in the region. The report also said Kim invited Putin to visit the North at a convenient time and that Putin readily accepted the invitation. Kim Jong-un's talks with Vladimir Putin may have made things more complicated. The focus for the past year has been on direct talks between the North and the U.S., but Putin brought up the six-party talks and a security guarantee for Pyongyang. Our EG1 explains.
Will new players become active in the current North Korea-U.S. talks? The question emerged as Russian President Vladimir Putin raised the need for six-party talks during his press conference on Thursday after his banquet with Kim Jong-un.
If South Korea or the U.S. can guarantee the North security, then the multi-party talk won't be needed. But I don't think the two countries can come up with a complete mechanism to achieve that. So the North needs the six-party cooperation system as well.
Saying that all the regime wants is a security guarantee, Putin said the international society needs to promise the North that in order for it to denuclearize. The talks, which involve the two Koreas, the U.S., China, Japan, and Russia, have been stalled since 2009 as the North withdrew from them. And since last year's renewed momentum for dialogue, North Korea and the U.S., along with South Korea as a mediator and facilitator, have been the main players. But Putin also hinted at his hopes and plans of playing a bigger role, the mediator, by saying that he will talk with China and the U.S. to relay Kim Jong-un's stance. Pundits say this is part of Putin's strategy to expand Russia's regional influence, as well as stand up against the U.S. But pundits say this won't actually be helpful to the denuclearization talks.
The current denuclearization talks must be solved between the North and the U.S. in a top-down approach. That's how this problem can be tackled with speed. If we enter the six-party talks, it's not likely that this issue will be resolved within the Moon administration's term.
Meanwhile, responding to the Kim-Putin summit, the U.S. State Department has once again stressed that the international community is committed to North Korea's final fully verified denuclearization. Replying to Radio Free Asia's request for a comment, the State Department said Thursday that the U.S. will continue to work closely with its allies and other partners to achieve their shared goal of North Korea's FFVD. 이지원, Arirang News.
At South Korea's National Assembly, tensions are building over moves to give fast-track status to certain key bills. Four parties, without the main opposition Liberty Korea Party, say they're going to fast-track bills on electoral reform and on creating an independent body to investigate corruption among high-ranking government and public officials. They planned to do that on Thursday, but the Assembly descended into chaos after a physical standoff. The Liberty Korea Party, which is blocking the conference rooms for the meetings, said electoral reform requires bipartisan agreement and claimed the four parties were using illegal means to get the bills fast-tracked. The ruling Democratic Party condemned the Conservative Party for illegal violence, saying they will sue those involved. It was the worst violence seen since the Parliamentary Act was amended in 2012 to outlaw physical violence that had long been prevalent. The ruling party has called on the Liberty Korea Party to return to its senses, but the Conservatives have pledged to keep resisting until the fast-track move is scrapped. South Korea's central bank governor has convened a meeting with the heads of the country's major commercial banks to discuss the seriousness of the economic situation following a GDP report that shocked even the most pessimistic analysts. Our Cha Sang-mi has the details.
Following the revelation that South Korea posted its worst ever quarterly GDP figures since the 2008 global financial crisis in the January to March period, Bank of Korea Governor Lee Ju-yeol convened a hastily arranged meeting on Friday to discuss the financial situation with the heads of major banks. Lee said, quote, "There is a need to see the current economy situation in a serious manner and stressed that now is the time to seek policy solutions to reinvigorate corporate investment, the engine of economic growth." This comes after a striking on-quarter real GDP contraction of 0.3% in the first quarter. Exports also dropped 2.6% on-quarter, a sharper drop than the 1.5% decline in the fourth quarter of last year, mainly on decreases of electrical and electronic equipment exports. Citing slumping corporate investments for the reason for the decline, Governor Lee said investment sentiment has to be revived first in order to spark a recovery in economic growth. But he insisted the tough times won't continue for long, with government contributions and global economic conditions improving. Meanwhile, in a meeting with related deputy ministers on prices, the Ministry of Economy and Finance vowed to do its utmost to tackle low exports and investment through new economic policy directions in the second half of this year. The ministry added that Dubai oil prices, Korea's benchmark, rose to over $70 a barrel and said they will look into ways to respond to it. 차상미, Arirang News.
Now, GDP growth might be negative, but South Korea's consumer sentiment rose for a fifth consecutive month in April. The Bank of Korea said Friday that the composite consumer sentiment index was at 101.6, up 1.8 points from the previous month. It's the first time since September 2018 that the reading has risen above 100, indicating there are more optimists and pessimists about the economy. The central bank says the rise was due to an increase in people's positive responses related to their current and prospective living standards, thanks to improving job data and better stock market performance. The gig economy is where people take a series of temporary or one-off jobs instead of a regular position. Much of that work is bought and sold digitally. Our Ko Ryun-hee met with some people here in Korea who are getting in on these gigs.
Lee Do-kyung works in the finance industry, but after he gets off work, he holds wine classes. To inform people about his lessons, which deal with the history and basics of wine, Lee uses an activity platform service called Frip. In the Frip application, many hosts like him provide all types of classes from sports to culture, and people can easily sign up for them.
When I come here, I feel recharged and relaxed because the attendees pay attention to my classes. I learned about wine in France, and I want to inform people who have an interest in wine.
Lee is one of many involved in the so-called gig economy. McKinsey & Company defined it as irregular work that is bought and sold through a digital marketplace. This excludes ongoing part-time employment and freelance work that is not contracted through an online talent platform. Another popular example of people sharing their talent is in the fashion field. Many fashion designers spend their time outside of work giving advice to people in need of a new style. Chang Kyung-hee, a fashion director, is one of them. She's happy to share her experience with others.
Because I am a designer with a lot of experience, I am sharing my know-how with others. I think having confidence in one's clothes is extremely important in being confident about oneself.
So with more Koreans starting to get involved in the gig economy, what does the future look like? According to McKinsey & Company, online talent platforms, including websites like LinkedIn and digital marketplaces for services like Uber, have potential to increase global GDP by $2.7 trillion and benefit up to 540 million people by 2025. However, some analysts have pointed out that there are also downsides to the gig economy.
In the gig economy, workers on these platforms lack some conditions, including social insurance, like employment insurance. There are concerns over labor safety.
Although some experts say the low quality of employment may lead to slower wage rises, many say the change is inevitable and that individuals and companies should prepare for the gig economy. Ko Ryun-hee, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, the OECD says robots will take over 14% of jobs worldwide in the next 20 years. In a report released Thursday, the OECD said the risk of job automation is real. And in addition to the 14% of jobs that'll disappear, it said another 32% of jobs could be radically transformed. The OECD warned that a failure to respond to the changing work environment could cause social and political difficulties. But it added that technological progress also creates jobs. It recommended that countries adopt adequate labor market protection for workers. China is hosting a forum on its Belt and Road project. The foreign policy initiative China says will build infrastructure and promote trade to help countries in Asia, Europe, and Africa realize their potential. Vladimir Putin is one of the leaders at the forum, and South Korea has sent its finance minister. But the U.S. is sending only low-level officials. So Bo-bin has this report.
Beijing is hosting 37 heads of state and government for the second Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation. Some 5,000 global leaders from international institutions and business sectors are also attending the three-day forum. South Korea has sent Finance Chief Hong Nam-gi, who will discuss how to boost cooperation with China. Amidst the U.S.-China trade spat, the forum aims to promote Chinese leader Xi Jinping's grand geopolitical strategy, dubbed the Project of the Century, to strengthen trade routes from China to Southeast Asia, Central Asia, Europe, and Africa. This year's forum is also seen as a chance to build legitimacy for the Chinese leadership and the Chinese Communist Party. And Beijing is also looking to use the event to convince the international community of the value of the ambitious and controversial One Belt, One Road initiative. Bo-bin, Arirang News.
South Korea has been left off the U.S. watch list on intellectual property rights for an 11th straight year. The U.S. Trade Representative's annual review of intellectual property protection, the so-called Special 301 report, placed 11 countries, including China and India, on the priority watch list for piracy and counterfeiting concerns, and 25 countries were on its watch list. In the report, the U.S. said these countries will be subject to increased bilateral engagement with the USTR to address IP concerns. South Korea has not been on the watch list since 2009. The Seoul Central District Court on Friday upheld its ruling against BMW Korea for fabricating emissions tests. It confirmed a fine of about $12.5 million US. The court said the emissions appear to have been faked on purpose, and so it upheld the prison sentences of up to 10 months handed down to 6 employees. On the same day, the court decided to slightly reduce a fine against Mercedes-Benz Korea. It had also been found guilty of violating emissions-related certification procedures, but it cut the fine by roughly $85,000 to $2.3 million. Now, the markets have closed here this afternoon, and that means it's time for an in-depth look at the past week in terms of the global economy. And for that, I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Kim Se-wan, professor of economics at Ewha Women's University. Thanks for coming on, Dr. Kim.
Pleasure to be here.
Now, the U.S. and Japan, they're holding a second round of trade talks in the U.S. It's expected that this would focus on the farm sector, agricultural goods, but also cars. What do we know so far, and what can we expect to come out of this?
First of all, the trade talk between U.S. and Japan is a very important barometer of future Korea-U.S. talk on automobile and agricultural products, export and import. So we have to keep an eye on it in the near future. This time, U.S. wants to decrease its trade deficit from Japan by increasing their agricultural product export to Japan. And on the other side, Japan wants to confirm that there will be no further tariffs on Japan's automobile export to the United States. It looks this time that these two countries are exchanging these two items to each other. That means U.S. will increase its agricultural products to Japan, and U.S. won't be imposing further tariffs on Japanese automobile export to United States.
Is currency a major issue here?
Currency is also a major issue, but it is really sensitive issue. But they have something independent talk about the Japanese yen's devaluation and appreciation, but Japanese government is pretty much avoiding further talks on this issue because U.S. government is trying to appreciate Japanese yen, and if that happens, that's going to be another shock to Japanese economy after 1985 G7 meeting.
Yeah, indeed, and we'll see Prime Minister Abe and President Trump meeting on Friday. Meanwhile, in Beijing, we have the One Belt, One Road Forum. 37 government leaders from around the world meeting there to discuss this project, including South Korea's Minister of Economy and Finance. Now, what should we be watching at this forum, and what do you think will come out of that?
Well, it is going to be a huge meeting between the top leaders of the world, which is hosted by Chinese government. Except the United States, actually. U.S. has been pretty much unhappy with One Belt, One Road initiative from the beginning. Regarding the achievements of One Belt and One Road projects, there are mixed views. Some Asian and African countries participated actively through huge support of the Chinese government. But it is also true that some countries are in trouble and having a really hard times because of the hugely accumulated debt against Chinese banks and Chinese government. Because of that, some European countries like Switzerland, Italy, and Greece are delaying their participation on Chinese projects. And in the end, Chinese big dream of extending their economic power to European continent is kind of delayed.
Yeah, we see some projects have been canceled in some places.
Right.
And the debt, obviously a big issue. Now, this week, back here in Korea, we have the Moon Jae-in administration submitting a supplementary budget to the National Assembly worth somewhere a little less than $6 billion. They say that if they spend the whole thing, then that could raise Korea's GDP, which is in trouble right now, by 1/10 of a percentage point. But we have a lot of people also against this.
Right.
What do you think?
Well, as you said, $6 billion or 6.7 trillion won supplementary budget will give a positive impact on increasing income of the nation because it is going to be an income of somebody and income of some corporations. So that goes to more consumption and more investment for sure. However, there are two major problems. First problem is the tax collection is not enough for this year. So this time, 6.7 trillion won of the supplementary budget should be financed by issuing new government bonds. And that, in the end, worsens the budget situation of the Korean government. And second problem is Korean government is trying to stuff expense items after fixing total amount of the supplementary budget, which is 6.7 trillion won, which is something unnecessary items, like something expenses on anti-pollution system and something compensation for that old-fashioned cars and so on. So therefore, that kind of unnecessary spending items from government will cause a problem of biased expense problem and unfairness problem in the end.
Is it becoming a long-term thing? Because this is not the first time in recent years we've had a supplementary budget.
Right. Almost every year, starting from 2008's financial crisis, global financial crisis, Korean government is trying to build up a supplementary budget. But it is pretty much expected that there would be another round of the supplementary budget for this year.
All right, Dr. Kim, that's where we'll have to leave it today. But thanks so much for your insights this week, as always.
Thank you very much.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thanks for being with us. More live updates coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.